So welcome and thank you everyone for joining this Changing Planet seminar hosted by Imperial's Grantham Institute. This session will be recorded, and if you have any questions, please either put them on the chat if you're online, or we will do them at the end. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, which is Dr. Stephanie Wray, who is the founder and managing director of Nature Positive and the Chief Sustainability Officer for RSK Group. She'll be talking about the importance of biodiversity for sustainable development. Welcome.
Thanks very much to those of you in the room and online at Silwood Park. I find that really weird. It's a bit like talking at the Eurovision or something. But I'm glad that there were some technical hitches in making it all happen, because it makes me feel slightly better about my technophobia when an organisation who deals with mining on the moon has trouble with a link up with Berkshire. So we've got a lot to get through, really. This is the sort of thing that Becky asked me to talk about tonight, so I'm going to cover some of this. We're going to try and answer that. Do we think nature positive as a concept and something of a political movement is going to be a rival to net zero? Is it something that's going to turn our attention away from climate change a little bit? And I'm going to hopefully persuade you that it should to some extent. And to get there, we'll talk about how it relates to sustainability in the wider sense, how it's interrelated with climate and some of the social issues. We'll talk about last year's biodiversity COP, the year before last, I'm lost for years, the Kunming-Montreal COP, and what that means for nature policy around the world going forwards. And then I'll talk a little bit about the implications that's having for business and for other organisations and for governments around the world now. And maybe we'll have time to look a little bit ahead as to what that's going to mean in future. So first of all, let's get the terminology out of the way, because often when I say I'm going to talk about nature or biodiversity, people have different views. Now, biodiversity is a term that we hear a lot these days. That's the definition up there. I'm not going to read it to you. I've never really liked the term, if I'm honest, despite working in biodiversity for 30 years. I've never really liked it as a term. Didn't like it in Rio in 1992, and I haven't grown much fonder of it. And the reason I don't like it is because people don't understand it. It's immediately a disconnect. There's an immediate cognitive dissonance about what it actually means. So I tend to use the word nature when I'm talking about these sorts of issues. The terms are not interchangeable. Nature wraps the systems around biodiversity, if you like. So biodiversity is all of the living elements, and then you wrap air and water and land and soils around that, and you've got nature. So it incorporates all of the living and the non-living elements of the planet we live on. And of course, nature's in trouble. It's declining at alarming rates. We have something like 1 million species at risk of extinction at the moment. The rates of decline in species populations is faster than it's ever been, and we're basically living through a mass extinction event. And it's entirely an anthropogenic extinction event. If you were in any doubt, I know there are people who doubt about the involvement of humans in climate change, hopefully not so many of them anymore. There are similarly people who doubt about the human influences on the decline in nature. If you want to sort of put it in perspective, if we just take mammals, things with fur, then there is something like 1,000 megatons in biomass of mammals on this planet. 360 megatons of that is people. 680 megatons of that is domestic animals, things that people want to eat, mainly cows. And so there's a tiny amount, there's 2% of the global biomass of mammals is wild terrestrial mammals, and a little less than 4% is wild marine mammals. So we as a species have completely taken over this planet. We've transformed huge areas of the land and sea surface of this planet to do what we wanted to do with it, and we've squeezed most of the rest of the natural world into the tiny little spaces around us. And not surprisingly, that has some impact. Can I have another slide? I don't know if I can have another slide. There we go. So how are we doing this? What's happening? Well, to understand this, we need to accept that we are not apart from nature. Humans are not special. I'm quite fond of humans. They're not my favourite species, but, you know, they're all right. But we're not different to nature. We're just part of nature like everything else. We don't sit outside it. Our society doesn't sit outside it. Our economies don't sit outside it. Our economies are wholly owned subsidiaries of nature. That is where we sit, and you cannot possibly try to separate them, although we do. So across these realms, we see a range of drivers of largely negative change in the natural world. And they fall into these 5 main categories. There's our use of space, the space we take up on land, at sea, in fresh water, how much stuff we use, the resources that we consume, and how efficiently or otherwise we consume them. Climate change, climate change, it's important, it's a subset of nature. Pollution of all types, to air, to water, to land, and then invasive species and other disturbances, which is the one that often gets forgotten. And we can measure those impact drivers. These are the things that are driving the loss of biodiversity, and we can measure how each of those drivers works. And for an organisation, like a business, we can measure what it contributes to those impact drivers, and we can see its contribution to the loss of biodiversity, not just its contribution to climate change. But as well as impacting on nature, all businesses depend on nature as well. Now, I talk to a lot of businesses that say they don't. I look at a lot of ESG plans and sustainability reports from businesses who've done a materiality assessment and come out saying that biodiversity or nature isn't a material issue for their business. I would suggest they need to look again. Because how can your business, when you think, if you have a business on this planet, and I accept that some of you are mining on the moon, but if you have a business on this planet, then how can you not depend on nature? Because nature is everything, it's all around you. And we as ecologists tend to call these things that nature provides for us, which are free at the point of use, ecosystem services. And that probably explains why ecologists don't get invited to the good parties. But these ecosystem services fall into these 4 main categories. So we've got the provisioning services. They're the straightforward things that we harvest and use from nature: food, fibres, minerals, and so on. We've then got supporting services that underpin those, so the primary production, the fixing of energy from sunlight by plants, the nutrient cycling, and so forth. We have regulating services, which are what the homeostasis systems that keep everything on track, so things like climate regulation, flood management, and so forth. And then we have the slightly harder to pin down cultural services, the value that nature is to us just for the way that, you know, you stand in awe and look up at a great big redwood tree. Much harder to quantify, but no less important. And we do actually quantify these in some areas where we look at, for example, the impact of nature on health outcomes. In the healthcare sector, it's well known that people who have access to nature, even in fact looking out of a window onto something green, will get better from surgery faster than someone who's looking out onto a blank wall. So there are quantifiable values for even those more ethereal kinds of services. So everything relies on it. They don't all rely on it to the same extent. This is a piece of work done by PwC a couple of years ago, where they looked at all of the different industry sectors and worked out whether either their operations directly or the supply chain that supported them, to what degree it relied on nature. And as you can see, everything relies on nature, some more than others. Up at the top of the list, they're the ones that you would expect that directly harvest from nature. So things like forestry, agriculture, minerals, and so forth, construction. And lower down, some of the digital and comms and banking and capital markets. Although when you start to get into their supply chains, some of their reliance creeps up a little bit again. And it's been calculated that more than half of global GDP, that's something like $44 trillion a year, is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. So this isn't a small thing. This isn't the side interest of weird eco-geeks like me. This is mainstream to how we go about surviving on the planet. And of course, those impacts and dependencies on nature, those issues that we've looked at on the previous slide, relate into costs and benefits, and those costs and benefits can be benefits to the business or to society as a whole. The ones to society as a whole, I think we've traditionally liked to ignore. We call them externalities. We don't bother to include that on our balance sheet. When a country looks at its GDP, if we harvest something from nature, then that's a positive. That's boosting up GDP and growth, and that's great. We don't actually bother to add in the pollution costs or the costs of cleanup or the social costs of doing that. So what we're seeing now is a turn in that thinking, and that business, at least, and definitely investment into business, is being asked to think about these things. We're starting to look much more at the whole life, whole value chain implications of business. And this has led to this is a system level goal for all stakeholders. So the idea here is that biodiversity has been declining for decades, that at 2020 we're sort of tipping into this point where there'll hopefully be an inflection towards 2030 where we should get back to moving in the right direction again, and that we'd see full recovery of ecosystems by 2050. And so this is the global goal that we call nature positive by 2030. So by 2030, we're adding more, we're restoring more to nature than we're losing again, aiming towards full recovery and recognizing that that's quite a long way to go. It's a sort of a philosophical position, if you like. It's a global goal that we're striving for. It's not something that you apply at the level of an individual or a business, although people are trying to do that. So where you'll see lots of businesses with net zero targets or shops or products and so forth, I'm hoping we won't see that proliferation of this banana is nature positive, for example, because it's not quite so meaningful in the same way. So where does it fit into the wider approach to sustainable development then? Well, I would argue that, and I love a 10-year-old meme personally, but I would argue that we spend far too much time looking at carbon. People love carbon because you can put it in a spreadsheet, you can add it up nicely, you can balance carbon in and carbon out, and it's, we feel like we're doing something. And I've heard so many people say that carbon is the currency of sustainability. Carbon is not the currency of sustainability. The dollar is the currency of sustainability, like it is of everything else. But what we're doing when we're focusing on carbon is we've got this tunnel vision, and we're not looking at the wider implications. You can get to net zero and still be deeply unsustainable as an organization. What we need to do is accept that carbon emissions are not the problem. Carbon emissions, and therefore climate change, are a symptom of the problem, and the problem is unsustainable use of resources. And we need to look at that wider pattern of resource use in order to make sense of it. And we tend to talk in terms of the triple emergency. So when we're looking at these big global crises, we tend to think of climate, the loss of nature, and impacts on people, the increasing inequalities affecting people, and the interrelationships between those three things. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are a series of 17 interlinked goals that are aimed to move the world forward to living sustainably by the year 2030. You often see them in a little chart like a periodic table. I like this model better. I would, wouldn't I? This is from the Stockholm Resilience Institute, and it's the wedding cake model of the UN SDGs. And what it's saying is not that these are necessarily more important than the other goals that are shown much smaller. Nobody's ever going to argue that poverty and hunger are not important issues. But the point is that you can never achieve these goals if you haven't achieved these. These are the foundation stones and fundamental to supporting everything else. So you will never have a world with zero hunger if you haven't got a healthy biosphere that can support that many people. And so I think this is a good way of looking at how we structure our approach to sustainable development and making sure that we've got those building blocks in place. Right. So at the end of 2022, we had COP16 in Montreal, which is where countries from around the world, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, agreed the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework for the first time. And it was a bit of a nail biter, up to the wire, wondering whether we would get it signed. And I'm pretty sure that the DRC still didn't quite agree after the hammer went down, but we won't go there. And the mission of the GBF is to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and put nature on the path to recovery. So that nature positive goal, signed by 198 countries, as the direction that we should be taking all of our global policy. It's set up with a series of 4 broad goals around nature conservation, preserving those ecosystem services that we all rely on, benefit sharing and making sure that everyone has equal and fair access to the benefits from nature, and making sure that there's sufficient financing to underpin all of that. And it sets out 23 targets that are all urgent and actionable and to be delivered by 2030. So I'm not going to go through all of the targets with you, but it's quite interesting because it was slightly sidelined. I don't know, there was a World Cup going on at the same time, I think, so it wasn't really in the news very much, COP15, but it was a little bit subversive, actually, if you look at the wording of the text, and nobody really reported it very much. But it's not just about nature. It was assumed to be a sideline of meeting of people who like nature and want to save pandas and stuff. And we can come back to pandas if you like. But there is so much more than that in here. There is targets around how we manage land, how we plan land, how the planning system should work, how we should interact, how we should integrate nature into that, about the fact that we should be restoring 30% of the habitat we have damaged as a species by 2030. That's a lot when you think it's already 2024. The conservation, there's what's called the 30 by 30 target, that by the year 2030, we should have 30% of land and sea areas around the world, in each of those signatory countries, managed for the benefit of nature conservation. Now, if you ask the UK government, they'll say we're around 20-something, but that's because they're including national parks, which I would argue are not necessarily managed for the benefit of nature conservation and more really for farming. If you look at things that are actively managed for nature conservation and are in favourable condition, it's something closer to 3% in the UK. So we've got a little ways to go, you could say. So there's targets around species, there's targets about protected species, about CITES and the wildlife trade. There's targets about invasive species and reducing the impacts of invasive species, which have huge knock-on implications for agriculture, food chains, the shipping industry. There's targets around reducing pollution, including nutrient pollution and including plastics pollution, which is a massive issue for biodiversity. There's obviously targets around climate and how we can use nature-based solutions as part of our fight against climate change. And then we've got targets around sustainable use and benefit sharing, making sure that relevant Indigenous people and local communities get to share in any benefits. They're not hoovered up by large corporations. And then issues around mainstreaming and how it relates to business. So the need for businesses to report on their impacts on biodiversity. And you're all quite young, so I don't know how long ago this was now. I think it would be in the early 2000s. You may remember a lot of scandals around businesses that were, well, say, for example, Nike went through a terrible time over its human rights record. And around that time, people started to be aware of the impacts of palm oil. Palm oil was being harvested in tropical forests, that forest was habitat for endangered orangutans. And at one stage, a company called Dove, which I think is part of Procter & Gamble, ran a big ad campaign. And Dove is a lovely company. They do lots of great social stuff and body positivity. They ran a great campaign around Talk to Your Daughter about the fashion industry. It was a beautiful ad, beautifully shot. And Greenpeace Australia shot an almost identical ad with Talk to Your Daughter about this company, and showing rainforests being cut down and dead orangutans and so forth. And a massive multinational company, their share price dropped several percentage points virtually overnight based on an advertising campaign about how they use resources. So that message of saying, well, we're going to ask you, Mr. CEO, to tell us about your impact on nature. We don't need to wait for the next palm oil. That had huge implications, that it involved the setting up of the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. We're not going to wait for that. We're not going to wait for you to tell us what's the next big issue. We're not going to wait for the press to find it. You tell us, what are you doing? Where are you taking more than your share? Where are you driving those drivers of biodiversity loss? So that's a massive implication. There's also a target around subsidies. And a lot of those, they sound really obvious. Well, why would we subsidize something that damages nature when we know that nature's declining and we need it? But there are something like $2 trillion a year spent on subsidies which actively damage nature. So this target is around reversing that. First of all, identify them, because you probably in each country don't even know where they are. Identify them, stop them, and then reverse that funding into something that restores nature rather than destroying it. Taken as a package, these targets are amazing. They're transformational. I'll be interested in Colombia later this year to see how far various parties have got in starting to implement them. The UK government, I would say, is talking a good game, but I haven't seen real progress to date. Have I gone back one? Oh yeah. So what are we doing in the UK? Everyone's very excited about biodiversity net gain, aren't they, in the UK? I mean, we've been excited about it for about 10 years now, and we thought it was going to come into force about 4 times, but it finally did in February. So biodiversity net gain, the principle is very simple. You leave the environment in a better state than you did before. And the arbitrary number that we've chosen in the UK is that where we have a development, we'll measure biodiversity, and then post-development, we will add in some restoration or habitat creation, and that after the event, our site will have 10% more biodiversity than it had before. There are 2 main problems with that. One is really that, well, you can't measure biodiversity quite that simply. So the biodiversity metric that's used in the UK really only measures habitats. It doesn't know anything about species. And the other is really that, well, we've only applied it to development. About 7% of the country is subject to development at any one time. 70% is subject to agriculture. And that's where the incessant loss of biodiversity is coming from habitat destruction, from grubbing out hedges, from the use of pesticides and so forth. So again, we might be accused of perhaps looking in the wrong direction, or looking in one direction that's easy to tap into. It's easy to tap into rich developers rather than farmers, perhaps, you might say. So will it make a difference? I think it'll make a difference to urban design. I think we'll see some better designed developments which have some green spaces and biodiversity connections for people, which is important. Will it turn the tide on biodiversity loss in the country as a whole, or contribute to our 30 by 30 target? No, it won't. I'm not going to talk about that. So, yeah. We won't bother to talk, because I know we haven't got a lot of time, so we won't bother to talk about the regimes in different UK countries, but we can come back to that if anybody wants to. So what's happening then out there in the world of business? What is business doing about this? How has business responded in the last year since COP? Well, we've seen a huge amount of interest and investment. We've seen an enormous amount of interest, particularly from the financial institutions. Lloyds Bank last year was probably the first high street bank to appoint a head of nature. Even 12 months ago, I don't think I can imagine a bank having a head of nature. We're seeing investors asking more questions around nature, not just limiting those to climate change. And we're seeing an increase in some of the methodologies that are out there, and I'll talk a little bit about those. So what should could businesses do? What should all businesses be doing? Well, first of all, to go back to what I was talking about earlier in the talk, businesses need to understand how they depend on nature. They can't just write it off as an externality. They can't decide that it's not material for them. They need to understand where it is. And the reality is it's probably not sitting immediately in the room with them. It's likely to be somewhere up in their value chain, probably in their supply chain, perhaps in how customers use and dispose of the products that they make, but it will be somewhere. Then they need to understand from that dependency, they need to look at, well, where do they impact on nature? And again, that might not be directly. We see far too much of businesses just concentrating on what they do, where they do it, in their own premises, and thinking, well, we just bolt a few components together here and put it in a box and sell it, but they're not thinking about where the raw materials for the things they bolted together came from. So, are there key impacts and risks in your supply chain? Are you mining commodities somewhere in the world? Is what you send out of the door to your customers wrapped in plastic, and what happens to that plastic wrapping? What happens to your product at the end of its useful life? We're starting as well to see companies aligning around some key frameworks for understanding this, and sort of just in the same way that we've seen companies setting science-based targets for their climate performance and for their transition planning, and they're starting to disclose their impacts under TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We're starting to see equivalent structures for nature. So we have science-based targets for nature. The methodologies are starting to be developed there. I don't know if any of you have come across any of them at all. I'm finding that a lot of businesses I talk to are finding the methodologies terrifying and off-putting. There is some science in there, and it jumps very quickly from an easy explainer to scary hydrological modelling in some cases. And also TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And they will sit alongside each other in companies' annual reports, in their financial reports, not just tucked away in the sustainability report, but that because we're starting to recognise that these things matter, they are material financial risks for organisations. If you have a company that relies to construct its product on a material that's harvested directly from nature, and that might not be available anymore, either because it's overexploited and we're going to run out of it, or because there's a significant environmental impact around it and people are going to be aware of it and become unwilling to purchase products including that, that's a risk to the future of your business. If you have a process that uses a lot of water, that's a risk to the future of your business. If investors are asking hard questions about some of your impacts on nature or the implications of your product, that's a real risk to your business. And whilst I would argue that businesses have always been required to disclose these things, because you're required to disclose any material risk to your business. There's not a get-out clause for ones that happen to be related to the natural world. There is now an obvious and easy framework to allow companies to do that. So what do we do next? We start developing and implementing measures to reduce that, and we're seeing a lot of innovation at the moment of companies trying to bring down their resource use, develop new processes that use less water and so forth, setting targets and working towards that global goal of nature positive. And we haven't really got a direct equivalent of carbon offsetting quite yet. I'm sure it will come, and we can maybe chat about that at the end. But what we encourage people to do, what we all need to do, is to reinvest in those ecosystem services that we need. They're not infinite. They do need to be replenished and restored. So if you're a business that uses a lot of water, we would expect you to be reinvesting in the catchment that you use, in good catchment management and natural habitat restoration. We might expect you to be investing in agroforestry if you rely on a forest commodity and so forth. And we're seeing a lot of businesses starting to do exactly that. It's not simple. It is horribly complicated, but nature is complicated. That's kind of the point of nature, isn't it, really? It wouldn't work if it wasn't. And ecologists exist to kind of, as Douglas Adams would say, triangulate the vectors of interconnectedness of all things. We're there to understand and interpret complexity. So when we're looking at what are the biodiversity implications for a business, it's understandably quite complicated because we have to look about what they do, where they do it is hugely important. You know, carbon, a ton of carbon emitted here or in China, largely irrelevant. It's a ton of carbon. We look at different emissions factors when we're doing our calculations, but a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. If I have an impact on biodiversity, if I'm promoting those nature loss drivers, it matters hugely where I am. Am I in the middle of an urban area surrounded by concrete? Am I next to a river where it might flow down to reach habitats downstream? I'm in a biodiversity hotspot around the world. So where is a hugely important issue as well. So here's just some examples for the steel industry where we're looking across all of those impact drivers and assessing where are the higher and very high risks in that sector. We locate where they're operating and we look at, using various risk filter tools, we look at the levels of risk based on the location. And then, so we can see a map. So this is, you know, for a company that's relatively global, well, what's the level of risk in the different territories where you're operating? So they can start to focus. And so, unlike carbon, it's a sort of layers of what do you do, where do you do it, and what supplies do you need? So we look at the commodities and the inputs to that process as well. Turn that into a risk register, and then you can feed it straight into the enterprise risk system of the organization. Greenwashing. We hear a lot about greenwashing. It's quite popular. There's new legislation around greenwashing in Europe. And biodiversity is a really big risk area for greenwashing because, one, it's not really very well understood. It's in loads of high-risk sectors that have significant impacts on the environment, like agriculture and forestry. We have biodiversity hotspots around the world that coincide with some large amounts of economic activity as well. And there are lots of issues around consumption of resources and high-risk commodities. For example, anything that grows in a forest, or anything that causes impacts on forest loss. So, and I love this model of greenwashing that came from Planet Tracker about the different types of greenwashing we're now seeing. It's not just around putting up stories that are untrue or misleading. It's around following the crowd, following along at the back of the crowd so you don't draw any attention to your own bad practice. Or green lighting is around highlighting the one really good news story. Look at this thing, look at this fantastic project where we've replanted all these mangroves. It's great for nature and it's great for people, it's great for climate. Don't look at the other 99.9% of our practice. So green shifting is when you move your targets around so nobody can quite tell what you were supposed to be being measured against. There's always issues around labeling and labels like carbon neutral, or I'm sure we'll see nature positive bananas in the future. And then green hushing is something we're seeing a lot of now, where companies just don't say anything. They just don't tell us anything. They're too scared to tell us what they're really doing, so they tell us nothing at all. And biodiversity is a real hotbed for this, and we're seeing more and more stringent requirements coming from regulators, particularly in Europe, around making sure we're truly understanding business impacts. So where's it all going? Well, because we like to monetize things, then I think we will start to see biodiversity offsetting in the same way. And BNG in the UK is a form of biodiversity offsetting, a fairly basic one. But I think we'll see more complex systems, and there's a lot of groups around the world developing approaches to biodiversity credits at the moment. But we're not seeing the flows yet of money from. There's a huge amount of capital, pent-up capital demand wanting to invest in nature and things that are good for nature. And there's a great deal of projects that need funding, but at the moment there's a bit of a mismatch between the levels of risk and uncertainty in the two sides, in the scale, because if you've got millions of dollars to invest on carbon credits, you don't want to invest it in tiny little projects all over the world. You want to just stick it in one big lump. and in understanding of what the return is likely to be and when it's likely to be felt. So that's a huge area of investment and research at the moment. There's some great research grants around at the minute from UK Innovation, and I hope that this time around we're going to see some real practical projects that start seeing those flows of capital to where they're needed. It's very easy to invest in tech. It's very easy to invest in a new remote monitoring system that'll help us know how much forest we have. It's very easy to invest in a tech platform to sell biodiversity credits, but actually making that system happen in a functioning way is yet to be achieved. So, a few things to sum up. First of all, we have to understand that nature underpins everything. It isn't a side issue. It isn't something that's not material for everybody. Nature is the life support system for everything we do on this planet. And in stretching so far for economic growth and blocking everything out in the quest for economic growth and GDP growth, we risk letting go of our life support, essentially. When we talk about nature, it's really important that we don't just focus on direct impacts and the direct operations of organisations, which are sometimes quite small in comparison to their overall value chain. So it is important that we look both upstream at the inputs into that business and downstream into what happens to their products afterwards. And then finally, looking back at COP last year and thinking just how significant those changes are in society that we're talking about, don't think that this is a little bit more work for the sustainability department. Don't think this is just another tick in the box. Oh, there's another thing we've got to do on the form every year and disclose. We are talking transformation. We're talking about a completely different way of doing business. And I was just reminded of Netflix. You are definitely all too young for this, but when Netflix started, I remember Netflix as a service where they would post you a DVD. You would watch the DVD. When you'd finished with it, you would post it back to them. And their biggest rival was Blockbuster Video, bricks and mortar stores on street corners. And Blockbuster saw Netflix come along and thought, we don't have to worry about them. Nobody's going to want to mess about with all that posting stuff. And they didn't take it seriously. They didn't transform their business model in any way. They didn't see them as a threat. Look at the revenue of Netflix now and think about when was the last time you saw a Blockbuster Video store. And I would say that that is really where this is taking us. We're talking that level of transformation that we need to rethink how we do business in an economy that puts nature at the heart so that we can actually deliver on those goals, which really amount to nothing more significant than keeping us all alive. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions, including about pandas.
Okay, it's time for questions. Does anyone in the room have any questions for Steph?
Hello. Okay, good. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting, really insightful. I was wondering what's your opinion on the psychological approach to this. So we hear a lot of things about shaming. So, oh, if you want people to change, well, don't shame them. But at the same time, the polite way is not most of the time is not enough. So let's say you assess that a company takes a lot of water, as you mentioned as an example. And then the conclusion is that there's no better way of doing this. And yeah, the conclusion is like your company should not exist. Like, how do you approach this? And how do you shame people, like shame companies in a polite way or in a, I don't know. I just want to know like the psychological approach in a business setting.
Yeah, okay.
And what you think is the most optimal way of proceeding, because thank you.
Okay, that's a huge question. We could have had another whole talk on the sort of human aspects of this. Yeah, behavioural science is a really important part of any kind of change program. And we've seen it done well and badly over the years, I would say. And probably the sort of the image of the angry environmentalist shouting at people has set this whole agenda back a long way and made people put it in that box of, those are weird extremists. There was a story in the news today, wasn't there, about Liz Truss claiming there were environmental extremists in DEFRA. I thought that's great. So yeah, environmental extremists, oh, those people, they just love bunnies and pandas and things. We don't have to think about that because it doesn't affect our everyday life. And I don't necessarily agree with shaming people into doing things. I don't think that's the way. When you make somebody make a positive choice, then you give them positive reinforcement. So how do we get them to make positive choices? Well, we need to make the positive choice, the choice that's right for the environment, to be the easier choice. We need to take friction away from making the right choice. And so how do you do that? Well, you do that by things like transforming $2 trillion worth of subsidies so that you're financially encouraged to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing. You do that by a process of helping people to take the small steps. And it can be frustrating to take small steps, but it can really work. There's a zoo in Australia, Zoos Victoria, and they've done some fantastic campaigns around wildlife and some of the rare endangered wildlife in Australia. And one of the ones that they did was around recycled toilet paper, because obviously toilet paper uses a huge amount of paper. It's using up a lot of very valuable forests in Australia that's habitat for rare and endangered species. So if they can get people to stop using virgin paper and not cut down as many trees, they'll have more habitat for wildlife. And they ran a great campaign with this, just encouraging people to try, would you try recycled toilet paper? How do you get them to try it? Well, you find out what are the barriers stopping them doing it. Because most people want to do a good thing. If you ask somebody if they want to be a nice person or a horrible person, most people are going to say, I want to be a nice person. So why are we not being a nice person? What are the barriers? Well, it's price. Okay, look, here's this toilet paper. It's not any more expensive. It's comfort. Feel it, it's really soft. Oh yeah, so it is. Well, it's just a bit icky, isn't it, recycle? Well, it's not recycled toilet paper, it's just recycled paper. And they made a joke out of it. They had people pledging to use it. They had a kind of live action character called Crap Man bouncing around the zoo, which was quite entertaining. But they made something like, at the last count, 800,000 people switch from using virgin pulp to recycled pulp in a household setting. And they made a difference just by making it fun, making it easy, understanding what the barriers are and removing them. So if I want to go to talk to a company that's using a huge amount of water, I'll use the same approach. I probably won't dress up as a cartoon character, but I will understand, well, what's the process? What are the barriers to it? Are they really just financial, or is it to do with how we've always done things around here? You know, maybe there are other things that we can try. And, you know, if you look at things like the amount of sugar in soft drinks, that's, once there was legislation in place, that went down massively. When companies are under pressure about their water use, from social pressure from their consumers, from governments, from taxes, they can change their ways. There are very few instances where there is just simply nothing you can do.
Thank you very much for your talk. Really appreciated it. And there's so many different questions I could ask. So I'll just pick one. I wanted to ask maybe the elephant in the room, biodiversity offsetting. And I wanted to ask, but I mean, I could ask a very broad question, but I wanted to ask actually quite a specific question about biodiversity offsetting. Most of the current examples of offsetting that we've looked at, or I've looked at in abroad, deal with area-based impacts. You have a project that's got a particular area footprint, and then your offset, you know, usually relates to some sort of area-based compensation. I don't, as a precursor to this question, accept any arguments that say we shouldn't do biodiversity offsetting. I think offsetting is absolutely required. So my question would be, for impacts on biodiversity that are not area-specific, so things like pollution or things where a company knows that it has an impact on biodiversity, but it could be over a very broad area, it doesn't have a specific project site, especially for companies, you know, that have impact abroad. What do you think will be the form of offsetting in the future that will exist to be able to compensate for non-area based biodiversity impacts?
Yeah, I mean, I preface this by saying that most impacts are broadly area or regional based in some way. So you'll know broadly the part of the world that you're talking about where you might want to focus efforts. That said, I think what we'll see is rather than that area for area offsetting and the American approach to mitigation banking is a classic, you know, impact an area, a hectare of wetland, acre of wetland, then build an acre of wetland. It's one for one, so you get brand new, recently planted, crappy wetland, 1,000-year-old marsh. Yeah. We can decide how equivalent we think they are. I think what we'll see instead is a much deeper understanding of the ecological function that we're losing. So what are we actually affecting? When we pollute this watercourse, well, what are we affecting? What species are we affecting? What ecosystem services are we affecting? And how can we put that back? So you may not be able to track down an impact to a location in quite such a detailed way for some issues. A good example I'd say would be a company that uses plastic bottles, that sells a soft drink in a plastic bottle, might consider that an appropriate reinvestment in and restoration of some of the ecosystems they damage would be investing in some of these ocean cleanups or these baffles in rivers that stop plastic bottles and other plastic waste getting down to the sea, for example. So a large-scale investment in a specific technology or approach that will tackle the specific impact that they have at a reasonable scale appropriate to the scale of the damage that they've been doing in the 100 years that their company has existed, for example.
Any other questions from the room?
Hello, thank you for the talk. I have a quite packed question. So I come from this area of working with businesses myself. I used to work at World Business Council for Sustainable Development.
Ah, right.
Yeah. So we worked with food and retail companies. So specifically, we worked with 54 companies. So let's say 40 of them comes from the West and 14 of them comes from, Global South, as you might say. So basically, when you have standards such as SBTI or TNFD or EU taxonomy, there's a lot of cases where, companies like Nestle would have a lot of capital to invest in disclosures about biodiversity and, understanding the materiality, doing double materiality. But on the other hand, you have businesses that may have the exact same nature of business, such as Nestle, that was supplying to, let's say, Waitrose, right? When you have that capital that are able to, tick the boxes for the standards, then you capitalize on that opportunity. Whereas, for the companies from the Global South, you don't have the opportunity and the capital, human capital even, to tick the boxes in terms of standards. So, do you see this as kind of a trade barrier, or how do you ameliorate the situation?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I'm saying about how we're responsible for our whole value chains. Companies sort of hide behind the fact that they're not in control of their value chains to go, well, that's somebody else's issue, isn't it? But the company at the center, who's usually, if it's a large global company like that making a lot of money, is calling the shots, is dictating the terms, and they share the responsibility with their suppliers for the environmental impacts of what they are asking to be supplied with, and they share the responsibility with their distributors and their customers for what happens to those products when they leave them. And so I think we need to see much more of that upstream investment into supply chains to help companies in the Global South, but also small businesses, single proprietor businesses, small scale farmers, and so on, are going to need support. They're going to need to not just be told, you need to do better, you need to not cause deforestation, but for the larger companies and for the Western economies to say, let us help you. Let us help you work out how to grow shade-grown coffee in a natural rainforest system, for example.
Okay, do we probably have time for one more question, although it is technically 5 o'clock. So, go.
Different question then. I wanted to ask about financing and capital. You mentioned that there is a lot of capital ready to be invested, but I noticed the word you used was invested, and a lot of the sense I get from this is that companies are willing to spend, some companies, very large amounts of money, but they see it as an investment, and therefore they have a sort of expectation that at some point in the future they'll be able to recoup value on that investment.
Yeah.
In terms of they're not just spending money on saving panda bears to no financial gain. If we're going to achieve that sort of 2050 vision of full nature recovery, it strikes me there's probably going to have to just be a lot of spending without any recoupable investment money. If you're a company that wants to compensate for action, that's going to require sort of paying a penalty to compensate rather than just investing in nature and recouping value. So is the only way to achieve that through legislation, or do you think there is a way where companies can invest and reap everyone can reap financial benefit from the recovery of nature? Or do you think we will have to ultimately, only legislation will ever get us to the point of making companies pay for the damage that has been done and therefore the restoration that needs to be done?
I think that my personal view is that a lot will be driven by investment, a lot will be driven by the financial markets, but that we will need some legislation, policy, taxation policy particularly would need to change if we want to see real change fast enough. Because we are seeing change through investors, but it's really not fast enough at the moment. There's sort of two types of people, I think, with pent-up cash to invest in these things. One is the companies themselves, the large corporations, that it's a real risk for them. It is a genuine risk. So they're not investing philanthropically, though they might say that they are in their annual report. They're investing with an expectation of mitigating a significant risk to their future profits. Then you've got the sort of more institutional investors who want to make a return, who think, oh, well, if I could develop some massive site and create 3 billion biodiversity credits along the model of a carbon credit, I can sell those to all of those companies over there who realize this is a significant risk to them. That's the bit that's really sticky at the moment, that isn't really going anywhere. But I think we are seeing companies realizing that they've got to invest in their own future, or they simply won't be here. The balance of legislation and free market is going to vary hugely around the world among the parties who've signed the convention, I would say. But I do believe that there is a significant place for that if we're going to drive it forward in time.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for. So thank you so much for such a great
Thank
talk. Next month, I think the seminar should be on the 27th. And I think it's going to be Professor Jim Ski from the IPCC. But yeah, that's everything from us today. Thank you so much again. It was great.